Hello and welcome to the Inflectra webinar. We're going to be talking today about the new features in SpiraTeam version 5.3. And don't worry if you've got SpiraTest or SpiraPlan, we'll also be including that as well. So during the webinar, I'll be presenting and then there'll be time at the end for Q&A. So I ask you if you could keep your phones on mute until the Q&A. So in today's agenda, what we're going to do is go through some of the new features in SpiraTeam 5.3. Firstly, across the application, we've made some changes to the user interface, a refresh and some layout changes, and I want to highlight those. Secondly, we'll go through the new feature of exploratory testing. And this is the ability to run tests and write the tests at the same time. Thirdly, we'll be going through some of the new test configuration functionality for both manual and automated testing, which will let you do data-driven testing more easily than in previous versions. And then lastly, in the core system, we've updated the graphing engine and we've added some additional graphs. So we're going to go through some of those just so you know they're there. And then lastly, in the plugin category, we've also updated our Visual Studio plugin to work with the latest version and made some changes. And at the end, we'll have time for questions. So with no further ado, let's go into the live application. So this is SpiraTeam 5.3, so I'm just going to log in. And while it's logging in, one thing I'd like to highlight is we've tried to make the user interface as consistent as possible across the application to improve the usability and also to improve efficiency. So if we go into an example of the requirement pages, so on the list pages we haven't made significant changes. Most of the effort has been on the pages one level down that we call the detail pages, the pages that show all the information for one artifact. And I'll show you requirements, but I'll also show you test cases as well, so you can see the commonality. So on the requirement page, there's been some major changes. First of all, if you remember in the older version, we used to have the workflow editor in the top left and in its own tab. Just putting the people on mute. And one of the challenges was the workflow was here in the top left. As you scroll down to add comments and make actions, you would lose your workflow, which was difficult. The second thing was that the title bar, we had a title bar which would display the title, and we had a text box where you could change the title, which was redundant. And then the third issue we had, if you remember, is we had lots of boxes around everything, and we had the various fields all arranged in a 3-column grid, and that was good because it made it mobile responsive, but it was bad because it was hard to find all the fields, especially compared to some of our earlier versions that weren't mobile responsive. And so we took that feedback into consideration, and what we've done is gone for this grouped format. So the first thing we've done is the name is now a single editable text box right at the top, so you can see and edit it at the same time. We've then moved the requirement icon and the name and the type of requirement, in this case it's a feature, right here in the toolbar. And that's true for test cases and defects and releases and other parts of the system also. And then we've centralized the workflow right here. So the operations to change the workflow status is in this drop down next to the status. And as you scroll down, what you'll notice is they get smaller, but all these features are now still available. So if I want to add a comment, I can add the comment right here. Hit the save, change the workflow, and do it all at the same time. So that makes it very easy. And then in terms of the grouping, we've grouped them now by releases, all the fields by releases, which would have, in this case, just the release, but on the defect it would have the detected release, the resolved release, the fixed release. For people, it would be both the 2 built-in fields, which is the author and the owner, but also any custom fields, like a review owner or a user field. Also, we've then moved the dates and times, which were previously at the bottom in schedule or just scattered with the other controls, into their own dedicated section. So any custom field or standard field that is a date or effort field, you'll now see here, making again it much easier to change things and adjust things. Also, it means when fields get hidden in the workflow, we don't have gaps appearing, which is a nice feature. And if we want to compare this with the test case view, we'll just go over here into test cases. And again, if we click on the link to the detail page, you'll notice that it's the same concept. We do now have the name of the test case right here. We have the test case ID and the icon, the status. We also do have, in this case, an execution status too. So we have the ability to include things like the execution status, and on tasks you'll see the progress bar right here. And it also remembers it as we go down the page. We've also grouped the various fields, people, properties, and dates and times in the same way. And you'll see here we do have this review owner, which is the custom user field, which will previously be separated out, which is now grouped with the other people fields. The only difference on this between this and the requirements page is that we do also have a folder structure, so you can navigate the folder tree in this left-hand view and change items. Whereas in requirements, it's a single hierarchy. In both cases, you'll also notice we have also added the subscribe option, and that lets you, and you'll see this throughout the application, so you can now not only subscribe to the item, which you could do before, I'm subscribed, but I can also add other followers. So if I want to have someone else who might be useful to this, look at it. So let me add Fred, maybe. I can add Fred. You can now see different users appear here in the followers and send them a message if that makes sense. One thing we did do specifically on the folder-based pages, that will be the tasks, the test cases, the documents, and the test sets, is we've now included the folder path. One of the criticisms people had was they could arrive on this page maybe outside of the folder structure because they were clicking on a link from a requirement, for example, and the current folder that was selected was not the one that this test case belonged to. So you might be over here in Exploratory Testing. So now you do have the ability to always see the folder path of where this test case is. And we plan in the future making it clickable, which will then select the folder here. So that was some of the major changes we made on all the different pages in the application. There's been some other stylistic changes. You'll notice we've in general gone from a lighter user interface where we've got the sections with these new breakers with comments and a red underline. Before they had a big box around them. We've tried to reduce the number of boxes and borders and made the page just to be easier to scan. So when you're not actually editing something, it's much easier to see the content. When you do want to edit something, you can click on it and it still has a border and a drop-down list or a text box or a rich text with the toolbar. So everything is still there, but it just makes it easier to scan when you're not actually in the business of actually editing it, which is most of the time. The other thing we've done throughout the application, which is less evident from the user interface but equally important, is we've improved the efficiency of loading the pages. So previously, if you remember, if I was on this test case and I went to the next test case, like test case 5, it would reload the whole page, which took some time. I mean, not a lot of time, but a little bit of time. Now when you click on it, it just updates the data in the current page. So now you can navigate around the tree structure, both the folders and the test cases, much faster. And that performance is a huge benefit when you're doing lots of editing or navigating through the tree structure. And that's true also on things like requirements, which are hierarchical. Same thing. You can click on it really quickly, and it now moves, just change the data, no page loading. The other thing we've done is throughout the application we've standardized some of the association panels, as we call them. So if you remember on the previous version, we had already done this on the requirements page. If I was on a requirement and I wanted to add some test cases, I can see this list of test cases in a grid. I can filter and search, of course. Then when I want to add, I choose the option to add. This panel appears, and I can now both just simply browse the structure like this, or search. Previously, if you remember, you could only type in an ID number, or you could look at a small little dialog box that was hard to find things. Now you can actually search as well. So that was already in the previous version, but we've done this now throughout the application. So if I go into test cases, I look at my requirements test coverage in reverse, I now have the reverse view. I can look at the requirements tree. I can search by name, RQ5, for example, or I can just browse or search by name. Book. There you go. So you do have the ability to do searching by ID, by name, or just browse the folder structure or the tree structure. And the same thing is true for releases. Again, we used to have a small little slider that would appear that was very annoying with a left and a right side. It was very small, people couldn't find things, there was no searching. Now you've got all these different options for searching ID and by name, or just browse. So that's another big improvement. You'll see this throughout the application. It's not just on these pages, it's also in the test set viewing, the defects. Anytime you select an item, you're going to see that option. So those are some of the main UI enhancements we added in this version. So the next thing we're going to talk about then is the Exploratory Testing. And there is a webinar we already recorded which goes through this in more detail, so we won't go through it in a lot of detail today. Please watch the other video on our YouTube channel if you are interested in exploratory testing in more detail. But what it does let you do is choose a specific type of test called exploratory testing, and then that test can then be used in a different mode. So this is the test case here, which we did during that last webinar, and it's got a type of exploratory. And when you start out, it may have very few number of steps. It may have no steps at all. Maybe it just has an initial description. But when you go to execute it, it will launch in exploratory mode as opposed to regular mode. And the key is you have to have that type exploratory turned on for that particular test case. You'll notice you're in the right mode because you'll have this in the URL, test execute exploratory. You'll also notice that you have this add button right here. And that shows you that you can basically add and remove test cases and edit them during execution. So if we went through this test case, we passed the first couple of steps, and we get to the next one, which was entering a login with this many characters. In a traditional test case, we can pass and fail it and record a result. In an exploratory test, we could rewrite the test. We can add steps. So for example, maybe we enter a username and password because it's not called a login. Or maybe it's an email address. We've changed it. So in exploratory, we could change the expected result, and then we can also still enter an actual result. Passes, hit pass. That's good. Let's add another step. So we can now add steps, you can remove steps, you can drag and drop the order. So you have the ability to edit them on the fly while doing it. So this step might be verify that you cannot log in with an expired password. The expected result would be the system lets you know that it has expired, which would be good. Actual result was it let me in anyway, which would be fail. So you can both pass it, and the other thing you can do in exploratory testing, which is different, is as well as logging an incident, which is a bug, typically, you can also log a task. And this was added because one of the key things in exploratory testing is you're dealing with potentially an unfinished system. It's not ready yet. So I don't want to log 1,000 bugs to drive the developers mad. What I really want to do is just tell them there's something they have to look at because they might still be in the middle of it. So a task might be check that the disabled passwords are being checked, something like that, and you can then add that as a task. So that does give you the ability to actually add a task that's not a defect, and tasks typically have shorter life cycles, they typically have shorter workflows, so it's much easier to actually communicate back and forth with the developer without a formal bug being logged. And if you notice, we just put a name in. With a bug, we probably would want the version I tested, the browser, a lot of meta information, which we have right here. For a task, it's very simple. I just put the name, description, and add it. So again, it's a much more free-form way to communicate with the developer. But the benefit is when I actually go back to this test case after the fact, which is what I'm going to do, I can actually see all the tasks that are open against it and just see, are we ready to retest it or is it still in development? The other big difference with exploratory testing is when I hit the finish button, I have two options. Option one is to just finish the test case, which is what I would do normally, and that just records the result but leaves the original test case alone, or I can update it and that will add my new step and change the step that I edited. So if you go into this test case, you'll see that we now do have additional steps at the bottom. We have the email address rather than the login. We have the results recorded, and we also do have the linked tasks, both from this webinar and the one last week. So we would now know that none of these have been started, developers haven't done anything yet, so really there's no point trying it out again. And this task tab is also another new thing we did add to the test case page in this version as well. So that's the exploratory testing, and again, that's just a quick overview of it. In a nutshell, it lets you edit the test cases on the fly, write the test case on the fly, still record results, and you can create tasks. And if you want a bit more insight into that, please look at the other webinar that we recorded last week. It's on our YouTube channel. Now, in terms of the test configurations, for data-driven testing, this is another new feature we added. And in this feature, we added the ability to separate out your test data from your test sets and test cases. So this is where you go to testing configurations, and this is a whole new section of the testing menu that was added. Now, before we do that, let's go back and recap a little bit why we would use this feature. If we go back into test cases, first of all, we have test cases that we might parameterize. So we have this ability to create new book, and in this test case we have some parameters that we can pass through. We can pass through there's the browser name, the login, and the password, and those get sent through into the child test case. And some of our other test cases have the same thing. And what we would traditionally do is go into the test set view, and we might create a new test set. So we'll call this data-driven testing, like that. And what we'll do is we'll add 2 test cases to our test set. So here's my test set page. Notice it also has the new user interface with the folder path, the fast loading, the grouped fields, the lack of boxes, the integrated status bar at the top. That's all the same. Another thing we did change to be consistent is when you add the test case to the set, we have this new selector that matches the same style we're using everywhere else, giving me the power to search and filter. I'm just going to add 2 test cases. I'll add that create new book and edit existing book. Hit save. So now I've got 2 test cases right here. And in the old version of SpiraTeam, what I would do, or SpiraTest, is I could then either set a value of the parameter right here. I could say add the browser name, the login, the operating system, the password, the URL, and I could do that throughout all the test cases, or I could do it at the individual test case level. I could do edit parameters right here, and I can set the values right here. Now, that's really good if I want to run the test set once with one set of data. Now, where we get in trouble, though, is if we want to run this same test set for maybe 2 or 3 different logins and 2 or 3 different browsers, which is a pretty common task, that's a lot of test sets. We'd have to clone the test set or just keep changing the values and rerunning it each time. And when you talk about automated testing, you don't want to have to run it each time by hand. You're going to have to basically create maybe 10 different test sets for each combination. And you can still do that in the new version. So nothing has changed, but we have added a new feature. So if we go back into our test configurations, we now can create a configuration completely separate from the test set we're using. So let's go in here and we'll go to test configurations, and we're going to create a configuration called testing all of the browsers and logins. When I create my set, I can give it a description if I want to. This tests all the valid logins and web browsers, for example. Once we've done that, we now can add the data. Now this is where we have a new feature where we can take this option to populate. What it will do is it will take any of the test case parameters in the project. For example, let's take our login one. And we can now populate that from a custom list, the same custom list that we use in our custom properties, like this, and that's a list of values. So we can say that this login parameter matches this login custom field. Hit add. Similarly, this web browser name matches web browser. That's the parameter name, that's the $browser name parameter that we saw. This is a custom list, and we're just associating them. So that makes sense. And then you hit populate. Yep, it warns you because it will remove any entries that were in the grid already, and there aren't any, so it's okay. And it's now going to show you all the logins and all the browsers. Now that might be perfectly fine, or you might decide that, well, the administration interface of this application doesn't need to work on Opera. Maybe the borrower, the end user's view doesn't need to work on IE, or maybe, let's say, the librarian view doesn't have to work on Safari. They don't have any Macs there. So we could decide to remove those. And that's just because not every combination is valid. You might have Windows and browser. Doesn't make sense if it's Safari. You might have a Mac and you might have IE. Well, that doesn't make sense either. So you can always customize this list. So now we've got the 10 different valid combinations. So now we go back to our test set, and we can simply go here, just refresh it to pick up the new option, and we now have configuration, which if I click on it, will include testing all the browsers and logins right there. Hit save, and now it's going to populate the browser and the login value with the parameter. Now it doesn't populate the other ones, so the operating system, we can still set that as we would have done before. Operating system, Windows maybe, although we have Safari, so that probably doesn't make sense in real life. We'd probably have to have operating system be one, but you can have a mixture of things from the test configuration and things in the test set. And when you go to execute it, it's now going to basically loop through all those combinations, and instead of having just 2 test cases in my test set, it's going to have a large number, probably 20, assuming that both test cases have an actual set of steps. There we go. 20 test cases. So that's an example of a data-driven test, and you can then loop through it and see the different values. So here we can see using IE, using Firefox, using Safari, using IE again. Now we move on to different login, and so you're now looping through all the combinations. So that's your data-driven testing, and this is for manual testing, which is obviously a benefit, but the bigger benefit is also going to be from automation testing as well. And to take advantage of that feature, you will need to use the latest version of Rapise launcher, which is coming out in Rapise 5.4. So if you are using an older version of Rapise, then you'll need to upgrade to the latest version once it's released in about 2 weeks' time. And for people using other automation tools, we will be releasing Remote Launch version 5, which will be new, and that will also support this new data-driven testing. As of right now, if you use Remote Launch 4, the current version, it will only see 2 test cases and just run those. So we are updating Remote Launch as well. So please be on the lookout for that new version, and that will then give you access to this data for automated testing as well. So that's the second thing on the testing side. If we go back to our agenda, the last piece was the graphs and graphing engine. And some of this is stylistic. If we go into the reporting section, first of all, we've got some new graphs and charts. We've got a new graphing engine, so the graphs do look a little nicer. The progress graphs have this curved look that we call a spline graph, and it's just a bit cleaner. For all the graphs use this new engine. So if I go into here, x-axis, and maybe I choose important, so that's the same one, status, there we go. You'll see it's a new engine. It's got a slightly nicer look and feel. It's more responsive on mobile. The tooltips are much better. And this is a particularly good feature when you have a large amount of data and you have one data point that may be very, very small. Maybe it's 1,000 on the axis and you've got 1. It was easy before to miss that 1, and that 1 failure could be really critical. So now the tooltip will always display even if there's no or very little visible data, so you can make sure that when it looks like 0, it's actually 0. It isn't just almost 0, because the difference between the two can be the difference between a serious bug being released or not. And similarly with the test cases, you do the same thing. This new engine, and this new engine also fixes one of the other persistent issues, which was when you exported the graphics before, it didn't actually give you the axes, which was a bit annoying, and that's been fixed. So you now have the axes. So that's quite nice. You still can, of course, get the data grid and export that to a CSV file. Nothing has changed there. We did also add some tooltips so people do get a better sense of what the graphs do and what they're for. And then the other thing we did add a few more actual graphs using this new engine. So the first graph we added was the incident count by status. So before we had it by priority, we had the cumulative count, the open count by priority. Now we can see by status, and using this hover feature, which is also new, you can actually highlight the actual data range. So you can do it by status, which is nice. And then on the testing side, we've added 2 more graphs. We added a test. This is a test run progress graph. That shows you the number of test cases run each day, which is very nice. We've had that for a while. The problem with this graph was if you ran the same test case 3 times, it's going to show up 3 times the amount. Well, what you really want to know is what is the progress of the unique number of test cases that have been run? Because if the same test case has been run 3 times, that's different to you actually running 3 different test cases. One is showing progress, one is just showing activity. So if we change it from test run progress to test case progress, you can now see the gray at the top will show you the total number of not run test cases available. And as we add test cases, we added one during a demo right here, you can see that very easily now. And you'll see the days we've actually run the test cases and whether they passed or failed. Now this run count is not cumulative, that's important. So when you do want to see the cumulative count, which is actually more useful in many cases, you choose that option, and it takes a little bit longer to generate, but now you get the cumulative count. And this shows you over the life of this release or this project, because you can filter by release, how close are we getting to actually fixing all the bugs and all the tests passing. So you now get a sense of the gray bar at the top is the goal. We want to get ultimately no gray at all. Everything should be run, and ultimately everything should be passed. So you'll see that the different areas move up in time, and you'll actually see us get closer to our goal. That graph is also available as a shortcut on the home page. So we did take the test case graph and we added it into the testing dashboard. The testing dashboard also does have all the new graphing engine as well. So before, if you remember, you had this requirements coverage graph. Sometimes you had, like for example, is that blocked 0 or is it just very small? Well, it is actually 0. You can now always verify the data. And you do now have the cumulative count graph available here as well. And we've also added the same tooltips on all the graphs. So that's some of the graphing enhancements. Oh, we also did add a donut chart in the instant open count. Previously you only had the bar chart, which showed you by priority. Now you get the open and close count. And that graph is actually also available on the instant list page right here. And you're going to see more of these graphs throughout the application in the next version coming out in January, version 5.4. We're going to be adding more graphing options using this new engine that we have. So that's an overview of the graphing engine. And the last thing we did is the Visual Studio plugin. We've also released some new plugins for IntelliJ and for Eclipse as well, so feel free to check those out. But for Visual Studio, we've simplified and streamlined the plugins, so it's right here. And what it lets you do is, first of all, it installs from the Windows Visual Studio Marketplace, and it installs right here in Visual Studio. And the use case for this is I am a developer and I've been assigned some defects to fix. I've got some tasks to implement, some user stories to complete, and I want to be able to have them right here in my IDE. I don't want to have to keep alt-tabbing back to SpiraTeam all the time. And it's nice to also have it persistent so I can see everything I have to work on. And so we added this new plugin, and what you'll do is you go into this option here when it first configures, you put in the URL, login, password, and the project name. Once you do that, it actually stores the project name, ID, and the URL in the solution file. So when someone else opens this project, they don't have to enter that URL or that project number in. That's permanently part of the Visual Studio solution in the SLN file for those who are used to Visual Studio. And then for the user settings, which is the login and password, we store that in the user settings, the SUO file. So that's something that's stored just for you. And it also remembers that across projects. So if, for example, I open up different solutions for the first time, it's going to know my login and password. It's already got the URL and the project ID. It's all set to connect. So it streamlines the process of opening a new project. It also means if I close this and open up a different solution, I'm going to have a different SpiraTeam project and URL connected to. So I don't have to keep managing that separately. Now, when you see all the items, what do we have? Well, we have basically your contacts. That would link you to a person. You have all of your assigned defects. And you also have your assigned requirements, ones that are assigned to you that are not yet obsolete, and any assigned tasks. And we do provide a tooltip, which if you look closely, shows you some key information, the description, the dates, other key fields, priority, progress. Similarly for requirements, there's a tooltip. And lastly, if you click on something, as well as a tooltip, we do populate the project properties window right here, which is nice. So that way I don't have to, if I want to look at it quickly, I can use the tooltip. If I actually want to have it visible on the screen when I'm working on some code, I can do that too. Just click back. Also, I can cut and paste things from here. Now, when you want to actually open something, you just simply can double click or right click and go view in browser. So we do actually open the browser to show everything. Actually, it's going to show it in Firefox. So let me close that. And basically, that's a nice feature because it means you haven't got to go open the browser manually, finding the item. And we originally had it open in Visual Studio in a customized form, but we found it was actually inconvenient because usually you want to have your code visible and then you want to be able to refer to this. And so it actually made a lot of sense just to open the browser. So we've actually streamlined this to make it open the browser automatically. And then the other really cool feature is when you want to commit some code, which is something you're going to do, go here, do commit. Maybe it's a version, maybe it's Git, like that. Well, you really would like to say, I fixed the bug. And you can go to SpiraTeam and you can go to the URL. You can click on the item, you can cut the ID out, which is fine. Right here, you can cut and paste this in. Or what you can do now is in Visual Studio, just go right click, copy to clipboard. Now we're going to commit, paste, there you go. So that way it simplifies and streamlines the process of actually committing code and tagging it with the appropriate artifact. So that's an overview of some of the new features in SpiraTeam 5.3. There's been some other smaller bug fixes and enhancements. The biggest changes across the board are the usability updates we've done, which basically let you have the same user interface experience across all the artifact types. The fields are grouped. It's much faster to load pages, and so that as a whole makes the use of the system much easier. Thank you very much for attending the Inflectra webinar on SpiraTeam 5.3. Hope it was useful, and feel free to watch other videos on our YouTube channel which cover various other topics, including exploratory testing and custom reporting. And if you would like to keep up to date on additional events, please visit the events page on our website, where we'll be announcing additional webinars in the coming weeks. Thanks, have a great day.